Well, thank you for joining us for another daily devotion as we gather together every day and just have a piece of the Word together to feast on and to meditate on throughout the day. Recently, we've had some time to be outside with our kids, and one of the things that Stone has been asking us to do so much is to have a chance to fly his kite. And there was a time where there was like no wind for several days, and he'd go out and he'd say, "Daddy, can we fly my kite? Can we fly my kite? Can we fly my kite?" And we'd say, "There's no wind." And he would go and he'd open the door and he'd put his little hand outside and he'd feel, and I say, "You feel any wind?" He'd say, "No." But one day we were coming home and suddenly the trees were moving and the wind was blowing, and he looked out and he saw the trees blowing and he said, "Daddy," he said, "can we fly my kite?" And I said, "I think today's the day." And so we went outside with this Spider-Man kite, and we took it out and we flew it around in the yard. And what's interesting though is it's incredible to see the way that this is made. If we turn it to the other side, I want you to see this, and you may already have known this, but what you see in this is a cross. You see the cross beams that provided the structure it needs to have lift. You know, when we get into the story of Joseph in the Old Testament in Genesis, what you see is at every chance there was an obstacle in his life, he always had a chance to rise. He always had a chance in the biggest obstacles, in the biggest struggles. For example, when his brothers rejected him and sold him into slavery. The Bible says, "But God was with him and made him successful in all that he did." And so there he was at Potiphar's keeper and as Potiphar's servant, and he served Potiphar so well that suddenly God gave him success in everything that he did. And Potiphar put him in charge of everything. And then there was a false accusation, and Potiphar's wife wanted to have a relationship with Joseph, and Joseph, being a man of God, fled from that situation, and he refused. And again, in that obstacle, he rose. And it doesn't seem like it at first, because that false accusation lands him in jail, and he's there for quite some time. In fact, he interprets the dreams of two men while there, and he asks him, "Do not forget me when you go back into the presence of the king." But yet they forget him, and when they're in the presence of Pharaoh at that time, they totally forget about him until about 2 years later. One person that he interpreted the dream for, he dies. The other person, he lives, and 2 years later he mentions that there's this man in the dungeon, in prison, whose ability is to interpret dreams. Now, I want you to think about this just for a little bit, because once again, the Lord had made him so successful in Potiphar's house, in prison, and now he was making him successful in Pharaoh's house. So much so that Pharaoh put him in charge of everything, in the administration of the goods, of the grain that was going to be harvested. And they had to store it up, because in 7 years of good, they were going to have 7 years of famine. And I think about that in our life, that often we have to wait for the wind to be in our face before we rise. See, every kite needs wind to be coming up against it. And this provides what people who fly kites know as lift. And it provides this. And suddenly you see it lift off as the wind comes against it. I want you to know this, that sometimes it may seem that life is against you. It may seem that your family's against you. It may seem that your friends are against you. It may seem that everybody is against you. I'm reminded what Max Lucado said about Joseph in one of his writings. He said this, he said, "Any chance he'd be the same for you? Here you are in your version of Egypt. It feels foreign. You don't know the language. You never studied the vocabulary of crisis. You feel far from home, all alone. Money gone, expectations dashed, friends vanished. Who's left? God is." If Joseph's story is any precedent, God can use Egypt to teach you that he is with you. Your family may be gone. Your supporters may have left. Your counselor may be silent, but God has not budged. His promise still stands. "I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go." Genesis 28, verse 15. You know, later in Joseph's life, he quotes something that's very, very interesting. It's Genesis 50, verse 20. And he says, "What you meant for evil, God used for good." I want you to know that in your life, what the enemy has meant for evil, what he has done to oppress us, what he has done to work against us, what he has done to oppose us and be against all the plans that we have made in our life, is often the very plans that God uses for good, and it provides the lift that we need to fly in the face of the wind. I pray today that you know the grace of God in your life through Jesus Christ. And I pray today that when tough times come, you raise up and you soar in God's presence through Jesus Christ and His great grace. We love you and we're thankful for you. Thank you.